Welcome to Focus on Abilities, a program about issues affecting the lives of people with disabilities. I'm your host, Lex Frieden. Today, through the resources of the Municipal Channel of Houston and ILRU, the Independent Living Research Utilization Program at TIRR, we have the pleasure and the honor of bringing you this program from Washington, D.C. It'll be a great program. We have a wonderful person to interview, and we are going to talk to the director of the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, Kate Seelman. But before I introduce Dr. Seelman, let me ask you a question. The answer will be evident. Who was the first woman director with a disability of the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research? With that question, the answer, Dr. Kate Seelman. Thank you for being our guest here today.
Thank you, Lex.
Kate, now you are the responsible for the nation's rehabilitation research program. What is the scope of the NIDR initiative?
The scope is very, very broad, Lex, and I think it represents the independent living and community integration orientation. It includes medicine and health, research, it includes technology, it includes the social sciences and in the area of employment, and obviously independent living. We have a strong research program in statistics and a very, very strong commitment to dissemination. But we also are the main link between our community and the larger scientific community, both basic science and, well, mainly basic science in the United States.
Now, many people may believe that an organization like NIDR, a government research organization, does research. But in fact, NIDR basically funds research. It sponsors research. Is that true?
That is true. Our NIH calls it extramural, but what we do is we support research through requests for applications in the Federal Register. They come in, they go through a peer review process, and then determinations are made.
Now, about how much money per year do you spend on research?
$81 million, Lex, on research, and then we also administer the Assistive Technology Act, which is the deployment act for assistive technology. So we do both, which is a very strong tool for the disabled community.
Now, you mentioned the process. The way research is funded through your agency is through, first of all, identifying priorities.
That's correct.
How is that done?
Well, we have a very active, dynamic, long-range planning process with a long-range plan, which really is quite directed to independent living and community integration. Within that dynamic process, we do focus groups, constituent groups in various areas. We also receive information from our own researchers through program reviews. So it is a constant interchange of ideas and information.
So that information is what basically generates the long-range plan.
That's correct.
And from the long-range plan, you have priorities in different areas.
Very good.
And you announce those priorities, as you said, in the Federal Register from time to time.
That's true.
Once the priorities are established, then you generate requests for application.
That's correct.
And the role of people with disabilities in this whole process?
The role of people with disabilities, there are multiple roles for people with disabilities. Some of them are absolutely, I think, still kind of revolutionary. And let's talk about the role of people with disabilities in the research process, both here and in Europe. And NIDR is very involved in international work. There is a realization, a growing realization, that applied research, problem-oriented research, has to involve disabled people from inception, the idea, to the dissemination process. And for example, in engineering research, the whole idea of battery research, for example, in electric wheelchairs, and looking at lighter batteries, or so an individual has a very good idea of what they need on that chair and what the kinds of problems are on those chairs. So anyway, from inception, where that kind of problem is often stated, we want lighter batteries, we want more storage in batteries. I might say the same thing about my hearing aids. to working it straight through. And we've had some very interesting projects. For example, our robotics laboratory has a consumer laboratory, and the consumers and the engineers chose a few projects. One was a remote operated vacuum cleaner, and they worked together to develop a remote operated vacuum cleaner.
Have you seen it?
I have indeed seen it.
Does it work?
Well, I myself stay away from vacuum cleaners, but but yes, indeed, it does work, and it was quite an interesting interaction between the consumers and the engineers. Both had to learn. I mean, it's a social process. It's not only a research process in that way.
Now, we can expect to see the remote vacuum cleaner on the market for the general public at some point in the future, perhaps, and that raises an interesting point. Many of the benefits to the society at large today are a product of research that was done to benefit people with disabilities historically.
Absolutely. I think that the mother who is looking at us right now with the baby carriage, the traveler that's pulling the luggage, all thank us for the curb cuts.
The child,
the bicyclist, everybody.
The child who's putting on their shoes using Velcro straps.
Velcro, very good example.
Is a function of a rehabilitation design originally made by occupational therapists to help people who had...
The operating system adjustments in Windows 95, 98, which I might add that Niter Engineering Laboratories developed, are very useful to a lot of people. For example, people who have carpal tunnel, repetitive motion problems. So there are many, many usages.
And the first automatic transmission on an automobile was made for a person, I understand, with paraplegia who needed assistance to drive. So, Kate, with that in mind, how would you characterize the history of rehabilitation research and juxtapose that with the future?
Well, I think it's had an exciting history. I think that we want more people, more users involved as we move forward. The history in the early days was very connected in the early part of the century with veterans and war. And that gave the impetus for medical rehabilitation in the post-Second World War period, which eventually brought forward rehabilitation engineering, as you well know, being a tremendous leader in the whole area. So you began with engineering, you began to have all kinds of strange and radical ideas about not only improvements in function and support in function, but environmental access and what research can do to support environmental access. So you have, in the future, I think what you'll see in the medical area, I think pharmaceuticals are coming a long way, and the whole idea coming out of, again, another Niter laboratory is actually recovery in the whole mental illness area. In medicine and health, we're going to see, I think, extraordinary breakthroughs in biomaterials that will be applied, for example, in our own burn systems, and we do support burn systems. We're looking into biomaterials right now, sphincter control technology, and so on and so forth. However, in the health and function area, we're also going to be giving, hopefully, more support to health and wellness, and the whole idea of the concept that people with disabilities are often healthy, and usually healthy, like me, and we still have to maintain health. So the health policy area is also going to be a very important part of the future. In engineering and technology, miniaturization is going to be very important. Sensors are going to come up, which gets me to another point. In the disability area, we have to connect to basic science, and we have to connect to science and technology policy in the United States, and we're beginning to connect to that, because over there in the federal laboratories are the battery technology, the miniature circuitry that could go into hearing aids, but it has to be transferred. A tank turned into a stair climber takes a rehabilitation engineering laboratory. And from there it takes a marketplace, and from there it takes consumers and providers who can afford to purchase them.
Now, you mentioned the finite resources of the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research. But you would probably characterize any research that's done ultimately to benefit people with disabilities as rehabilitation research. So in fact, besides the $81 million in research that NIDR funds, there's also a lot of research going on in other federal agencies and even some privately sponsored research that benefit people with disabilities.
That is true, and through our Interagency Committee on Disability Research, we have relationships with, regular relationships with the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, the federal laboratories, the Veterans Administration, which essentially is the Rehabilitation Research community within the government. And rehabilitation, I was looking at the definition of rehabilitation, and rehabilitation means, in its Latin form, to equip. That's a very, very good place and understanding of rehabilitation, and broadening out to independent living.
Now, Kate, I've been concerned for some time that we are far too dependent on taxpayer dollars, on public funds, to generate research to benefit people with disabilities. What would you say to private philanthropists and foundations? How would you describe the need, and how can you assist them in identifying the need to fund research?
Well, I think that partnerships are very, very important with the private sector and with the foundation communities. NIDR has partnered with these communities and wants to in the future. And I think by coming in and visiting with me and with NIDR, we can further develop these areas. Certainly, we visited a number of foundations, and I know a number of our grantees are working with foundations and are also working with the private sector. We need to do more of it. We need not to be, we need to welcome innovation and entrepreneurial activity. And I think we've seen a lot more technology transfer and involvement with small business and larger business in our engineering laboratories now than ever before.
NIDR has, in the past few years, focused on what I would consider to be more generic research programs that benefit people with many different types of disabilities. But you also continue to fund some programs that are specific to a particular disability. Can you distinguish the reasons why it's necessary to do both?
Well, the closer that it comes, the research comes to a medical area, the more specific you have to be to physiology and anatomy and so on and so forth. So that's one area. So it is also true that even up to the function area, a person who is deaf or hard of hearing has certain kinds of accommodation requirements that are different than a person who has challenges in the mobility area. So it is clear that we will be careful about the kinds of choices we make and be very clear about our support for anything that looks like it is condition-oriented. But reality is that in medical research, an ear is very, very different than lungs.
Yeah. Kate, now, one of the areas that I know you're personally interested in is independent living by people with disabilities. And many of my colleagues in the independent living field sometimes feel as though they're disenfranchised by research, by the fact that research focuses on more medical conditions, and yet NIDR is one agency that has historically focused on adaptation, on environmental issues, and on applied research. How would you defend the research program to independent living advocates who might say it's misdirected in that area?
Well, I think that the independent living advocates are using the benefits of research, and the hearing aids and the wheelchairs aren't grown like grass. It takes many, many, many years to develop these tools for whatever we use them for, employment, mobility, hearing, so on and so forth. I also think that we need to have our researchers and grantees working more closely together with independent living because we can have more community-based technology.
How would you encourage people with disabilities to get involved with researchers? How would they, somebody find a researcher to work with or to advise or
well,
to?
On the NIDR website, and I would also say ncddr.com website, you'll see the list of all the research and training and engineering centers. I would also encourage people to go on and get an education that would equip them to do and be a part of the research community. NIDR hires and looks very, very really looks for individuals who have the combination of experience with disability and the credentials to understand what a good research project is. Because we have the responsibility to be able to say to the disability community, the findings of this research are useful, valid, and reliable. And we must base what we do in science.
So to people with disabilities, first you would say then that they should be more forgiving of research and realize that in fact while the research may not be specifically independent living program research, that much of the research you do benefits people in independent living. And secondly, to those who would have contributions to make, you'd encourage them to visit the website, find out where there are rehabilitation research programs, and get in touch with those people who are researchers, offer to be supportive volunteers, advocates, advisors, and to those who have the interest, you would encourage them to study and to become researchers themselves.
Absolutely.
Now, you have a distinguished career as a researcher in your own right. Can you just tell us your own personal experience and what qualified you for the job as director of the nation's disability research program?
Well, I have a degree, a PhD, which concentrates in science, technology, and public policy. And however, behind that, I was trained, I have to say this, as a community organizer. And I worked in Harlem and the Lower East Side and did certain things in Chicago and so on and so forth. So I really do understand the disability community a little bit differently. I sat on many disability boards, and certainly myself helped for hard of hearing and so on and so forth. I also was involved in a major study with Margaret Mead on the use of technology. So my early days also at the Research Institute at Gallaudet, working with just after Lex Frieden at the National Council on Disability, at the Administration on Developmental Disabilities. So I've had many experiences leading disability research programs and being a fellow and so on and so forth, National Science Foundation assistantship. So I bring together a number of pathways to NIDR, and it has been a real privilege to serve the disability community in NIDR, and I hope they understand, and I think they do more and more, that we are the disability community's research institute.
Kate, you mentioned a background in policy. You've made a great contribution to disability research policy, but you're also very interested in policy, the big picture, science policy. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, it's my feeling that that in order to mainstream the interests of disability research, we have to teach large science and to think about our problems. The federal laboratories, as I said, they have good battery research over there. Well, there are applications in our community, and somehow we have to make some linkages which are policy related. The elder community, which, as we all know, is a major demographic trend in the United States, simply in many cases is a question of function and accessibility also. But national science policy, national science and technology policy needs to aim at some social goals. Now, social goals for us are obviously independent living, community integration, and we'd like to see national science policy connect more to those goals, and that includes the needs of disabled people and elders.
You recently had the opportunity to take that message to the White House at the invitation of the President to set up an exhibit in the White House. How would you describe the reception that you got there? Do you think you made a good impression?
Well, that was a wonderful day. On, I believe it was January 13th, the President announced an economic initiative for disabled people. The third part of the initiative was assistive technology, and much of that part of the initiative was aimed at NIDR. We were invited to do a demonstration in the grand foyer of the White House, and we had, for example, a voting machine, an accessible voting machine, or an accessible kiosk coming out of one of our engineering centers. And the President and the Vice President, needless to say, were fascinated that we could produce a prototype piece of equipment that would allow anyone from people who are deaf-blind to people with other kinds of disabilities to vote and or to simply access information. And then, so we had the President, gave the President and the Vice President a private showing of accessible telephone equipment, voice output equipment, Braille output for music scores, and we had senators, and we had many of the cabinet just walking around playing with this technology and seeing that people with disabilities like music, people with disabilities want information, and if they have information kiosks, they can go about getting their information. They use the telephone. So there was a very, very good reception there, Lex.
Now,
I think that they have a bit of a vision of the future. And
do you expect that vision to be translated into real tangible support for rehabilitation research programs?
Well, one thing I would like to see as a policy, something incorporated into the speeches of the politicians as they move into further campaigns is universal design. That is, design the technology for the broadest range of ability. And that would be for people who are elderly, for disabled people, and obviously, as in the case of curb cuts, a lot of other people. Now, that would be a nice policy touch, wouldn't it?
Would be fantastic. Kate, we visited for a minute about the role of people with disabilities in research, but I want to go back to that for just a minute before we close the program. People with disabilities, advocates, family members, and others can certainly be involved in helping to establish priorities through being involved with the long-range planning process.
Sure.
You're also looking for people to be work on peer review panels to help make a decision about the research that's funded given the various applications you receive.
An individual with disabilities and one person who is a minority are on every one of our research panels.
And you're looking for new people all the time.
Yes, certainly.
And to be qualified to do that job?
Well, to be qualified, it would depend very greatly on what the application is. And if the application is, for example, we now have our health and wellness rehabilitation research training center going to be competed. If you have a background in the health area or in maintaining health, that's the kind of peer review we want.
But from time to time, you deal with a whole array of subjects.
We certainly do.
And you're looking for people with a whole array of interests and backgrounds and so on. And to be researchers, you would encourage people, and you have encouraged people to be researchers, people with disabilities, and to get involved in research programs. I know that you're a proponent of participatory action research, researchers working very closely, hand in hand, with people with disabilities to make sure that the product of their research is usable by people once it's finished, right?
Absolutely. It's very, very important not to produce a device that nobody is going to use, but the engineers will admire.
And finally, I think it's important for people with disabilities and the public in general to understand clearly the benefits of rehabilitation research and to be supporters of the rehabilitation research program at the public policy level.
Basic research is very important, but applied research is also very important. And NIDR is an applied research agency, really very problem-oriented, living with a disability, supporting the development of various products and processes, such as the ones you and I are using. And also very, very important is NIDR's work in making sure that as technology moves so quickly, disabled people and older people are not left behind. For example, when graphic user interfaces were adopted in the computer world, all of a sudden a lot of people couldn't work anymore.
Because they were blind, they couldn't see the screen, they couldn't manipulate it.
Right, and the programs they were using simply would not read the screen. Now you have to have applied research presence in there to help to support the next development, the next age of software.
And now we're beginning to see the results of that. More screen readers that are adaptable to Java and other new technologies. Kate, as we close the program today, I wanted to thank you, first of all, for being our guest, but also to give you the opportunity to close with any advice that you have for people with disabilities, the public in general, regarding how to use research.
Well, first of all, I invite you not all together, but to come visit NIDR and get to know what we do and let us get to know what you care about. But I also would say go on for an education. Think about research, rehabilitation, disability research as a future for each of you. And think of a society that is universally designed so that everybody can use the buildings, the telerehabilitation, the consumer products, and let us share that common vision.
Kate, congratulations on the outstanding work that you're doing, the leadership you're providing to our programs. On behalf of people with disabilities and the public, thanks so much.